What is the craziest war tactic used in history? The Persian Empire was noted as putting their largest men on their smallest ponies and organizing them into parade units. Enemy cities saw them from far off and thought that they were giants riding normal-sized horses, and would often either give up or it would lower morale just enough in order to get the upper hand. During World War II, US submarine commanders were generally only allowed for war patrols out of fear that they would become either too ambitious or too cautious after too many patrols. However, Commander Eugene Lucky Flucky of the USS Barr begged for and was granted a fifth war patrol. He then immediately asked that rocket launchers be fitted to the Barr. Already famous for his tactic of maximum harassment, Flucky became the first submarine commander to fire rockets at sure targets. But he didn't stop there. Noticing a supply train on one of the shores he watched, unable to use his rockets on it, Flucky sent 8 of his sailors ashore to rig a bomb under the tracks. As the landing party returned to the Barb, the train set off the bomb and was launched 200 feet into the air. This was the only time Allied forces landed on the Japanese home islands during World War II, and the only known time a submarine has sank a train. Flucky was a wild man though. On his way back to port, without any torpedoes left, he was one sunk ship away from winning a bet, so he rammed the Barb right into it. He also attacked 2 convoys, totaling over 30 ships, and set the world record for submarine speed, while fleeing pursuing ships after the attack. Easily the greatest submarine commander in US history. That's the most American thing I've ever heard. I can only imagine this guy wearing a cowboy hat while he did all this stuff. Not exactly a crazy tactic, but Alexander the Great wanted to attack the island city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. It was a half-mile off the coast. Key word was, they built a bridge of rock to get close enough to 4 archers, etc. Eventually turned it into a peninsula. 2,400 years later, it's still a peninsula. Julius Caesar plan at the Battle of Alesia is so bizarre. Can't believe the dude actually pulled off this strategy. During the final act of the war in Gaul, the Romans had the Gauls' army and their chieftain Vercingetorix trapped in the town of Alesia. Instead of assaulting the city, Caesar decided to go ahead with a classic siege to starve the enemy. He then decided that a normal siege wasn't enough, so he had his army build a 10 meters high wall with watchtowers around the entire city. Perfect plan, right? No one can get out. The city is fenced in law. Unfortunately, words got out to a second Gaul army that Vercingetorix and his troops were in trouble in Alesia. This army was heading straight for Alesia and was threatening to break the Roman siege. So Julius Caesar had another wild idea. Let's build a second wall around our Roman army and the first wall, so we can block the incoming Gaul army and keep the Alesia siege going. Woot. Roman soldiers built that second high wall again in record time, and the Gaul army that was supposed to save Alesia was instead welcomed by insane fortifications. They tried pushing through, but the Roman defeated them thanks to Caesar's super wall. Vercingetorix and his soldiers also tried to break the wall, couldn't do it. He surrendered to the Romans and Gaul was finally conquered. Law. In Mexico, a native tribe once destroyed a Spanish attacking force by setting up huge trenches and filling them up with all the peppers they could get their hands on. They proceeded to light it on fire, making a toxic smoke that was extremely painful to breathe. Chemical warfare, baby. When the Anzacs pulled out of Gallipoli, they converted some of their rifles to be self-firing, using string to pull the trigger and water dripping out of a can for the timer, and left them behind to make it seem like they were still occupying their abandoned trenches. So for a few hours, the Ottomans were defending against well-armed Beefdins. Iraq versus Iran war. Saddam electrified a swamp full of Iranian troops, then took all the bodies and built a road across the swamp and used it to attack. In WW1, the British airdropped opium-laced cigarettes on the enemy, and then when they started smoking and fell asleep, they attacked the trenches. This happened twice. Probably not the craziest, but pretty creative. Even the USS Texas was assigned to the D-Day invasion. They find the cannons didn't have the reach to keep supporting the troops, so the captain ordered one of the torpedo blisters filled with water This caused the ship to lean to one side, which increased the arch of fire of its older guns. Olga and the Drevlians. I'll summarize as best I can. This should be a movie. Olga was married to Prince Igor I of Kiev. Igor was in the guardianship of Oleg, who lead a tribal federation, became known as Kievan Rus, a territory covering what are now parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Drevlians were a neighboring tribe that participated in military campaigns with Kievan Rus and paid tribute to Igor's predecessors. They stopped paying tribute upon Oleg's death and instead gave money to a local warlord. In 945, Igor set out to the Drevlian capital to force the tribe to pay tribute. Confronted by Igor's larger army, the Drevlians backed down and paid him. But midway back, Igor decided they didn't pay enough and took a small party back to get more money. The Drevlians murdered Igor by a gruesome act of torture in which he was captured by them, tied to tree trunks, and torn in two. Olga ruled Kievan Rus as regent on behalf of their son. The Drevlians, emboldened by their success in ambushing and killing the king, sent a messenger to Olga proposing that she marry his murderer, Prince Mal. 20 Drevlians arrived in her court and told the queen why they were in Kiev, to report that they had slain her husband and that Olga should come and marry their Prince Mal. She agreed and wanted to honor them in front of her people. She requested they return to their boat, and in the morning, she would send for people to pick up their boat and parade it through town. The people lifted their boat, brought them into the court, where they were dropped into a trench that had been dug the day before under Olga's orders, where the ambassadors were buried alive. It is written that Olga bent down to watch them as they were buried, and inquired whether they found the honor to their taste. Olga then sent a message to the Drevlians that they should send their distinguished men to her in Kiev, so that she might go to their prince with due honor. The Drevlians, unaware of the fate of the first diplomatic party, gathered another party of men to send the best men, who governed the land of Dereva. When they arrived, Olga commanded her people to draw them a bath and invited the men to appear before her. After they had bathed, when the Drevlians entered the bathhouse, Olga had it set on fire from the doors, so that all the Drevlians within burned to death. Olga sent another message to the Drevlians, this time ordering them to prepare great quantities of mead in the city, where you killed my husband, that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him. When Olga and a small group of attendants arrived at Igor's tomb, she did indeed weep and hold a funeral feast. The Drevlians sat down to join them and began to drink heavily. When the Drevlians were drunk, she ordered her followers to kill them. According to the primary chronicle, 5,000 Drevlians were killed on this night, but Olga returned to Kiev to prepare an army to finish off the survivors. Olga led her army to the Drevlian capital and laid siege for a year. Stuck in a stalemate, she offered the Drevlians to pay tribute and her army would leave. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house was her request. Olga then instructed her army to attach a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth to each bird. At nightfall, Olga told her soldiers to set the pieces aflame and release the birds. They returned to their nests within the city, which subsequently set the city ablaze. As the people fled the burning city, Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them, killing some of them and giving the others as slaves to her followers. The reason why Americans call the British limeys between the 16th and the 18th century. A nasty disease called scurvy plagued sailors, killing roughly 2 million during that time. A surgeon named James Lind, who worked for the Royal Navy, figured out it was due to the sailors' diet, a deadly vitamin C deficiency due to the kind of food being served aboard ships. It became Royal Navy policy to squeeze citrus fruits, like limes, into their crew's grog to save them from scurvy. As a result, the British would often turn up with full manpower on every ship, while other crews were still being devastated by scurvy. The British figured this out in the 18th century, but the Americans didn't end up figuring it out until the next century, and were wondering why on earth the British kept trading for all their limes, as nobody else ever bought them. tossing a dead body over the side of a submarine, with top-secret invasion plans in a briefcase cuffed to his wrist to deceive the Nazis when they fell for it. There were a few things they did to make it seem like it was legit. They made it look like they were trying really hard to recover it. The way they did this was by using neutral Spain. They made sure it washed ashore in Spain, where they knew specific Spanish authorities who were active with Nazi spies would find it. Then they made a big show of trying to recover it from Spain before it fell into the Nazis' hands, while also trying to make sure it actually did fall into their hands. They went through the trouble of inventing a whole persona. They put love letters to the dead guy's fake wife in there, pictures of her and all. They put a lot of effort into it. During World War II, Japan floated hot air balloons containing incendiary devices across the Pacific Ocean, hoping to start forest fires. No fires were started, but one did explode and kill a few civilians. The media was not allowed to report on it, which eventually led to Japan abandoning the tactic because they were hoping to hear results on the US news. The US wanted to release bats with little incendiary devices tied to them from bombers over Japan, with the hope that the bats would roost in Japanese buildings, constructed from wood and paper, and then ignite them. They nearly burned down an Air Force base in testing. Ultimately, the atomic bomb became ready sooner than the bat bomb, so it was never used. I can't believe no one has mentioned this yet, but Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was having a hell of a time getting into an engagement with the French Navy. Then one day, the French finally committed to a battle after sailing out of a Spanish port, with the Spanish Navy at their sides. The total battle line was 27 British ships, against 33 ships of the combined French and Spanish navies. The Allied fleet formed a huge defensive line and invited Nelson to try to attack it. "Come at me, bro." Now when talking about naval engagements, you'll often hear of the term crossing the T. It was general tactical knowledge at the time that your best bet for winning a naval engagement was to cross the other party's T, basically allowing your own ships to give a maximum broadside to the front ships of your enemy's line formation. Attacking as a line into the teeth of a bunch of broadsides was considered suicidal, but good old Nelson was convinced of the superiority of the British Navy over every other navy in the world, and he was honor-bound to prove that point. So what did Nelson do? He yelled, "YOLO," and, after dividing his command into two-line formations, charged his ship straight at the Allied defense, thus crossing his own T, with his own ship, the HMS Victory, leading one of his two lines. His ship and the other led British ship took terrible hits, but they reached and broke through the French and Spanish line. But get this, when his two lines broke through, they kept right on sailing, which cut the French and Spanish navy into three parts, in between his own two lines. Suddenly, the French and Spanish navies were having their own T's crossed, with British ships firing all guns and giving full broadsides in both directions as they sailed right on through to the other side. As the smoke finally started to settle, 22 ships of the Spanish and French navies were destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost that day. Nelson, who died later that day from a bullet wound, and the British Navy sailed into history that day as eternal legends. Biological warfare. The earliest documented incident of the intention to use biological weapons is recorded in Hittite texts of 1500 to 1200 BCE, in which victims of tularemia were driven into enemy lands, causing an epidemic. The Assyrians poisoned enemy wells with the fungus ergot, though with unknown results. Scythian archers dipped their arrows and Roman soldiers their swords into excrements, and cadavers victims were commonly infected by tetanus as result. In 1346, the bodies of Mongol warriors of the Golden Horde who had died of plague were thrown over the walls of the besieged Crimean city of Kaffa. US recruiting Navajo radiomen so that their radio signals would be hard to decode. They were instrumental in maintaining uninterrupted communications in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Dad was a Marine artilleryman in the Pacific in World War II. The Japanese had perfect English speakers who would learn our maps. G2 equals Hill XXX. They would call in battleship fire on our troops and devastate the GIS. In the rush of war, time to code and decode was not there. Being able to know it would our guys Navajo. Asking for battleship fire was huge win for our own safety and quick effectiveness. In the French Revolutionary Wars, a French cavalry unit successfully traversed the ice of the frozen Den Helder harbor and captured the Dutch fleet as it was stuck in the ice. This was the first ever capture of naval units by a cavalry detachment. Marines of Fox Company in Korea used their own dead as decoys for Chinese raids. Chinese would attempt to get close stab what they thought were sleeping Marines and lazy sentries just to get filled with lead. Also, the one Chinese officer would speak fluent Chinese to make them think they came across friendlies. Siege of Malta 1565. The militia took a dead Turk, replaced his head with a pig's head and tied the body to a post. When the Muslim Turks saw the body desecrated with filth of a swine, they rushed out in the open to recover the body, which was in a kill zone for an ambush. In North Africa, the British put fake maps in a jeep. It was driven by an English officer who had been giving secrets to his belly-dancing Egyptian lover, who passed them on to the Egyptian Brotherhood, who in turn passed them on to the Nazis. The British found him out and decided to kill two birds with one stone. They put the maps in the glove compartment and instructed him to drive a certain direction. A bomb planted in the jeep by the British killed him and drew the Germans' attention. They found the maps, which indicated smooth driving at a certain narrow pass, which was actually sandy. The German tanks got stuck and were decimated by the British artillery hidden nearby. The book Bodyguard of Lies is one of the most fascinating war books I've ever read. The British in WW2 were amazing at deception. How the Australians cracked the Hindenburg Line in 1918. Step 1. At 5 a.m. fire a huge amount of gas into German lines. Germans get into gas masks and get ready to be attacked. Step 2. Don't attack. Repeat every day for a month. Germans will get used to the routine. Step 3. After 3 weeks, at 5 a.m., fire a massive amount of smoke shells and send 30,000 determined Anzacs through the haze at masked up and confused Germans. Step 4. Be back for breakfast. Persian general was stuck besieging a city whose walls were impenetrable. So, unbeknownst to him, one of his high commanders cuts off his own nose and one of his ears. He then goes before the general, who is a bit disturbed, asking why his commander would do this. The commander says that it is part of his plan, and he knew that the general wouldn't be on board with it if he asked first. The commander then informs the general that he will go before the king of the enemy city and claim that the general did this to him, and that he would like to betray said general for this mutilation. The commander then told the general to send his weakest men to a specific place, so that the commander, leading the enemy forces, could win a major victory, solidifying his place with the enemy city. The commander would then take over watch of one of the gates and simply let in the general's army, save for a few hiccups. It worked and the city was destroyed. I like the propaganda that the British were so accurate in their air attacks because the pilots ate a lot of carrots, which improved their vision. That caught on so well that people to this day still believe that eating carrots is good for your eyes. In the War of 1812, the British Canadians were trying to take Detroit, but were severely outnumbered. They only had a couple hundred British soldiers and a few hundred militia and native warriors. They couldn't wait because another American force was on the way. So as they set up camp across the river, they dug trenches and would march by in full view of the Americans, then duck into the trench and sneak back to march by again. At night, they would light extra fires, and at dinner time they would do the same trench trick, the same guys repeatedly lining up to get pretend food. They also gave extra British uniforms to the Canadian militiamen, so it looked like there were thousands of British soldiers. The Americans had men, but not the supplies or morale to endure a siege against an apparently superior British force, so they surrendered the fort without a fight. William of Normandy sent his best cavalry into battle at the middle of the Saxon line, then suddenly retreat in what seemed like disorganized panic. When they had retreated far enough, the cavalry turned and troops concealed on the two hilltops converged on them, and thus went the Battle of Hastings. The enveloping retreat is very documented, and even used as recently as Iraq on IS. It works because the soldiers on the ground are so focused on the immediate proximity that they don't think, they were laying down a pretty solid lick, and now they're retreating. This could be a trap. Instead it's just charge. I don't know if it's crazy or brutal, but Spanish conquistadors would unleash armored mastiff dogs on the indigenous people. The indigenous people hadn't encountered such large dogs, nor had they seen them in war. The dogs would be unleashed and would tear humans apart. The dogs were large, well-trained, armored, and extremely energetic and enthusiastic when set loose on people. Blitzkrieg, like it seems pretty now, but back when it's first deployed, it was unheard of. The concept, you would just blow past entire defense lines and hope your supporting units would keep the spearhead from getting cut off. It relied on pure speed and not to get bogged down, at risk of the entire breakthrough failing. The guy who founded my hometown was known as Stovepipe Johnson. He was a Confederate soldier, yeah, I know, during the Civil War, who captured an entire town that had been held by the Union Army by tricking them into thinking a length of stovepipe propped up onto wagon wheels was a cannon. In July 1862, in his Newburgh raid, Johnson captured the town of Newburgh, Indiana, bluffing its sizable Union militia force into surrendering with only 12 of his men and a stovepipe mounted and a burnt black log on the running gears of an abandoned wagon to form a Quaker cannon. His capture of the first northern city to fall to the Confederates made the news even in Europe, and Johnson's men thereafter nicknamed him Stovepipe. Cortez burnt his own ships to motivate his soldiers and give them no option for a retreat. It was succeed or die. Siege of Cluj, Albania 1450. One night during the siege, Skanderbeg sent out a herd of goats with a candle on each of the goats' horns. The encamped Turks believed it to be an Albanian attack and made a movement against the herd. When the Turks advanced far enough, Skanderbeg launched an attack against the force, destroying it. After the siege was lifted, Skanderbeg commemorated his victory by designing a helmet with the head of a goat on it, as a reference to his ingenious tactics used that night. The entire story of Skanderbeg is astonishing, every step. The Romans besieged a city called the Mishkira in modern-day Turkey. The Romans started digging tunnels beneath the city to breach the walls, and the defenders opened the tunnels on their end and released bears and wasps into the tunnels to attack the Romans. Now they lost the battle anyways, but it was nuts irregardless. The British announcing to the Muslim guerrillas that they were dipping their ammo in pig fat. Fighting was over in 24 hours. Russian soldiers basically dying from poison gas charged German lines while coughing up blood and bits of their lungs, triggering the Germans to retreat in panic. Joshua Milton Blahey, or General but Naked, is one of the most unhinged guys to even engage in combat. He and his unit would conduct ritual sacrifices and engage in cannibalism, believing it gave them power in combat. Also, as his name suggests, he and his soldiers would often enter combat wearing nothing but shoes and magic charms. They would also take drugs to enhance their combat abilities. Imagine getting in a gunfight with a naked cannibalistic dude who's high off his mind on who knows what. Googled this dude thinking it was going to be some 1700 stuff. At worst early 1900s, and the guy is still alive. He's 52. He has an Instagram page. What the heck? African cannibal generals can't have Instagram pages. Hitler was crazy. We all know this. But one time, his craziness worked. I'm no historian, so might leave out key details. In late 1944, Hitler knew he was losing, so in one of his last big efforts to fend off the Western invasion, he ordered armored and tank divisions to break through the Ardennes forest along the Allied line. Many of his generals advised against it, as Allied air support would obliterate any Axis advancement in the area. Hitler didn't listen to them, and the order was given. But it just so happened that a winter fog had suddenly fallen upon the forest and surrounding areas, making it virtually impossible for Allied planes to bombard the enemy or drop supplies for the army. The battle lasted more than a month, claiming the lives of more than 80,000 US soldiers. Eventually the fog would lift and Allied air support, combined with infantry capturing key towns in the area, forced a long and bloody battle to end. But it's just crazy to think about. Betting on weather conditions being perfect to achieve in battle is crazy, but it actually working is even crazier. The Night Witches. They were a Soviet all-female unit of pilots fighting on the Eastern Front in WW2. This was during Barbarossa, so the Soviets were being pushed back by the Nazis with incredible speed. There weren't a lot of modern fighters to go around, so the Night Witches were given old WW1 biplanes. What they would do was attack the front lines of the Nazi positions at night. They would cut their engines and silently glide down, drop their bombs, then turn the engine back on and flee to the Soviet lines. Because of this, they were completely silent, since the planes were old as heck. All they needed to take off and land was some flat grass. What's insane is that, because the planes were so slow, German fighters couldn't go slow enough to engage them without stalling. It was actually super effective, and the Night Witches had one of the most effective service records in the history of aviation. Share the craziest war tactic used in history. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.